So on November 24th, 1859, Darwin published On the Origin of Species. He did not publish his book within a neutral or peaceful intellectual atmosphere. Rather, his book appeared within an active battle zone, a culture war that had been raging in Europe for over a century. Indeed, a growing number of intellectuals and scholars in Europe saw Christianity as a major obstacle to human progress. The history of Europe seemed to confirm this. Historians call this notion the war thesis, or the battle or conflict thesis. The notion that there was an inevitable perennial battle between science, broadly defined, and fanatical religion. Ever since the Renaissance, remember what the Renaissance is a rebirth of. Ever since the Renaissance, centuries before Darwin, the learned of Europe increasingly remembered an ancient classical world free of totalitarian religious fanaticism, totalitarian in the sense of mind control. You were only allowed to think or speak certain things. A world free of torture in the name of God, free of genocidal religious war, which had torn Europe apart for centuries since the Protestant Reformation, especially. The liberal, multicultural spirit of the classical world that inspired thinkers of Darwin's time was known in ancient times as the Interpretatio Graeca or Romana, as summarized by Pliny the Elder, who lived in the 1st century of our era. Nomina alia, aliis gentibus, different names of the divine to different peoples. In other words, as many would say today, we're all worshiping the same God, those who worship, we just use different names. And this liberal policy included freedom for atheists. Thus, nearly 2,500 years ago, a gentleman named Democritus claimed that the universe basically consists of tiny atoms moving in empty space. Democritus did not bother with gods or deities since, even if they did exist, he reasoned, they did not causally intervene in the physical world. His ostensible student, the original sophist philosopher Protagoras, famously declared that man is the measure of all things. In other words, not some divine revelation. Man is the measure of all things that are, that they are, of things that are not, that they are not. He added, concerning the gods, I have no means of knowing whether they exist or not, unquote. Quite modern. Similarly, Epicurus, later, these are, we're going down through the centuries BCE, taught that whether gods exist or not, they are uninvolved with the world and are thus irrelevant to an analysis of the world. The Roman philosopher Lucretius agreed. None of these gentlemen were burned at the stake. So in the classical Greco-Roman world, for all its violence, there were no explicitly religious wars, no crusades, no inquisitions. The Roman authorities generally tolerated diverse religions as long as they did not disrupt public order, participated in state rituals to honor the Roman gods. This was for civic unity, not for serious religious commitment. It was equivalent to standing for the national anthem or saluting the flag, and as long as they did not defy the emperor's authority. So sporadic efforts were made to suppress Christians because they were perceived as threatening the social order by denigrating all other religions, because Rome was an extremely multicultural, multi-ethnic world. Anyway, I won't go into that, but so I'm saying the famous sporadic and very temporary persecutions of some Christians did not change the fact that in general it was a very multi-religious, freedom of religion culture. Otherwise, hundreds of religious groups freely practiced in the empire. Perhaps most importantly, other religions beside the state religion were not seen as agents of absolute evil, agents of a devil. And there were all kinds of religions that came from Europe, from Egypt, from Persia, from here or there, perhaps with Indian influence, and they integrated. Everyone was kind of, living together. We find a similar history in South Asia of multicultural toleration, most of which is now India. In South Asia, most of which is now India. In what is perhaps the most ancient book in any language, the Rig Veda, we find this declaration, ekam sat vipra bahudha vadanti. Truth is one. Sages speak of it in many ways. Ancient India, like the classical Greco-Roman world, hosted a wide religious diversity, yet an extraordinary degree of religious freedom within a multi-religious environment produced hardly any religious violence or oppression. Thus, the widespread of Buddhism and Jainism, both of which rejected the state religion in India, proceeded peacefully to proselytize. Both religions, Buddhism and Jainism, emphasized nonviolence, ahimsa, as a core tenet which guided their mode of preaching. These new traditions grew typically by philosophical debates, royal patronage, and social reform, rather than by conquest or violence. India, like the classical West, had a strong conviction that different people worship the same god or goddess using different names. It's also important to mention that at Darwin's time, India was a really hot topic. I don't want to go into the whole history. Sir William Jones, his discovery that Sanskrit was an Indo-European language, perhaps the source of Indo-European languages, but it was extremely fashionable to study India. I mean, what's his name? Henry David Thoreau. In America, Emerson, and many, what's that pessimistic European philosopher? Schopenhauer. So India was very much alive in the intellectual imagination of Europe at the time. So that's what's going on in Europe. Darwin is born into and is writing his book in this world, in which all this dynamic intellectual change and freedom is going on. So as a young man, Darwin attended Shrewsbury School, a prestigious institution that emphasized classical studies, including Latin, Greek, and the study of ancient texts. Thus, Darwin, along with other well-educated British and Europeans, was keenly aware of the intellectual and religious freedom of the classical world. This fueled among the educated a growing wave of criticism and rejection of the exclusivistic religious fanaticism that had poisoned Europe since 380 CE, when Emperor Theodorius I, under pressure from Bishop Ambrose of Milan, authorized the violent repression of Judaism and paganism and the destruction of their temples. So when Darwin publishes his book, everyone, all the intellectuals, just seize upon it, because it's almost like you're fighting this war and suddenly someone on your side invents this incredible new weapon. So, and I'll show that in a quotation from Thomas Huxley in a minute. This context, among other factors, explains why On the Origin of Species reverberated so powerfully in Europe and was an instant bestseller. For 1,500 years, Europe traced the origin of humanity to the Garden of Eden, as described in Genesis. But now, for a growing number of thinkers who abhorred the long history of fanatical religion, Darwin provided a scientific creation story that would transform Europe into a rational, science-based society. Thus, Darwinism did not arise within a neutral, detached, scholarly climate. From the day it was published, Darwin's theory was eagerly weaponized to strike a blow in a great historical battle to liberate humanity, in the minds of those people, from the ignorance of religious fanaticism. Traditional European religion was increasingly seen as the main obstacle to human progress. And again, this attitude was variously called conflict thesis, war thesis, etc. In that spirit, upon reading an advanced copy of On the Origin of Species, Thomas Huxley wrote to Darwin, 23rd November, 1859, about the impending attacks against him, Darwin, describing the critics in most unflattering terms. And as to the curs who will bark and yelp, in other words, like dogs, you must recollect that some of your friends, like me, are endowed with combativeness, which, though you have often and justly rebuked it, Darwin was a gentleman, our fighting for you may stand you in good stead. I'm sharpening up my claws and beak in readiness. So, it's quite colorful language. This letter shows that Darwin himself was not eager to use his scientific findings to battle religion. He was a member of his local church council or vestry in the village of Down, Kent, where he lived for much of his life. Thomas Huxley, the renowned biologist, anatomist, and paleontologist, had a very different attitude. He used Darwinism to decry a literal reading of the Bible, especially the Genesis creation story. His eager debates with Bishop Wilberforce and others typified and intensified the growing conflict between science and religion. The German biologist Ernest Haeckel fervently backed Darwin and urged a materialistic worldview that would diminish the influence of traditional Christianity in Germany. John Tyndall, Darwin's contemporary, insisted that science must replace religion as the source of moral and intellectual guidance and as an explanation of life itself, advice which unfortunately Darwin didn't take, as we'll see later. Anyway, I mean, there's... And then you have Andrew Dixon White, History of the Warfare of Science with Theology and Christendom, 1896. Framed the relationship between science and religion as one of necessary conflict. So there's all kinds of quotes here. So Thomas Huxley's essay, The Advance of Science in the Last Half Century, published in 1887, gives this colorful metaphor. Extinguished theologians lie about the cradle of every science, as these theologians are like the strangled snakes beside Hercules. And history records that whenever science and orthodoxy have been fairly opposed, the latter, orthodoxy, religious, have been forced to retire from the list, bleeding and crushed, if not annihilated, scotched, if not slain. Some nice Victorian language there. Here, Huxley referred to a famous Greek myth that baby Hercules was lying in his crib when two poisonous serpents slithered into the room, hissing, eager to kill the child, our hero. But when the serpents reached the cradle, infant Hercules grabbed the snakes, who were the priests of religion, and strangled them to death. So for Huxley, priests were poisonous snakes. Science was mighty Hercules who would kill this bad religion. Or as Marx put it, the abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is required for the real happiness. Abolition of religion. And we'll see how that turned into some really interesting genocide, that remark. Edward Gibbon, in his monumental work, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, said the introduction of Christianity became a fatal and irreparable blow to the great Roman state. So the great Roman Empire, this is the Renaissance, or the aftermath, and so this great culture was destroyed by Christianity. Herbert Spencer, who coined the phrase survival of the fittest, criticized the oppressive aspects of organized religion and argued for a scientific evolutionary approach to understanding society and morality. He viewed religious fanaticism as an outdated vestige of humanity's earlier stages of development, something which Auguste Comte, who sort of invented sociology, had said half-century before. And of course, Freud, religion is a system of wishful illusions with a disavowal of reality. So religion, and Nietzsche, of course, is going to jump on that. Religion just means denying reality. And in the same book, he wrote, religion would thus be the universal obsessional neurosis of humanity. Religion is a mental disease, like the obsessional neurosis of children that arose out of the Oedipus complex and all the blah, blah, blah of Freud. So Freud also wrote, religion is so patently infantile, so foreign to reality, that to anyone with a friendly attitude to humanity, it is painful to think that the great majority of mortals will never be able to rise above this view of life. So anyway, religion had its defend, that was from Civilization, had its discontents by Freud. Religion, of course, had its learned defenders, but it was in this growing atmosphere, obviously this is pre-Freud, of anti-religion intellectual warfare that Darwin published his famous book. So, continuing here, hope to squeeze all this in. I'm going to take a minute and talk to you about metaphysics for the simple reason that you cannot really, in a philosophical sense, understand this whole debate going on for a century and a half over evolution unless you really understand the philosophical sense of metaphysics. So I'm going to, and anyway, so here we go. Before we go further, we must have a clear grasp of the philosophical term metaphysics. You will soon see why. You definitely see why. The modern sense of metaphysics is complex, but for my purpose, I will use the term in a traditional way, as it was used for over 1,000 years. to indicate non-physical things that we consider to be real. For example, most consider it morally wrong to kill innocent people. Yet although physical bodies and violence against them are empiric facts, the moral wrongness of murder is not an empirical fact. It's not an empirical object and cannot be physically detected. This was David Hume. He introduced, and he was kind of leaned toward atheism, but he was making this point. Hence, it is a metaphysical, not a physical fact. Justice is not a physical object, yet most people believe that justice is real. If so, it is a metaphysical fact. Souls and God, if they exist, are not physical objects like spaghetti, rocks, or basketballs. If they exist, they are metaphysical objects. The same holds for beauty. Even if beauty is to some extent subjective, there's nearly universal agreement that some natural scenes, faces, bodies, or works of art are beautiful. If that view is objective or true to any degree, then beauty is a metaphysical, not a physical fact. We could multiply examples, but in summary, the word metaphysics refers to non-physical objects that we see as objectively real. I explain this here at an evolution conference because, as I will show, the debate over evolution is not ultimately a debate over physical claims, but over metaphysical claims. And the failure to understand this is the main obstacle to resolving the debate. I will explain another important feature of metaphysical facts. As Aristotle pointed out, not using this term, but the term came from the school of Aristotle, only metaphysical facts can stop an infinite regress of proofs and thus make it possible to definitely know anything. So whatever you claim is true, you can be pushed into an infinite regress of proofs. Prove this, we'll prove that. Like you claim water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. Okay, prove it. You heat a pot of water in the stove, it boils at 100 degrees Celsius. Then someone demands, well, prove that's pure water. Prove that's real mercury. You prove that, but then, okay, prove that those were really water and mercury testing elements. So you can be pushed into an infinite regress of proofs. To ever really resolve this, stop the regress, you have to declare that there is something which is self-evident, which proves itself. So Aristotle argued that all knowledge must ultimately be grounded in self-evident truths, axioms that are grasped intuitively. Science is based, for example, on the axiom, which you cannot empirically prove, that there's a real physical world outside your mind, or that other people have minds, that you're communicating with other real conscious people, not zombies. Or, so these foundational axioms, or the laws of nature, are uniform, as far as we know. These foundational axioms do not require proof because they are self-evidently true and serve as the basis for all contingent truths. You wake from a dream and intuitively know that the world you see now is more real than the dream world. You cannot empirically prove it, since your dream is not empirically available, but it is self-evident to you, and so on. So trying to skip some of the stuff, there's just a lot to go. So we can't prove empirically there's a real physical world outside our minds, since empirical truths are real only if the world is real. And to use a premise to prove its own conclusion is the model of circular reasoning, which is invalid. All the physical facts in the world rest upon the metaphysical assumption that there's a real world outside our minds. So, and for Aristotle and for most people, the ultimate guarantor of the reality of anything is what he called the unmoved mover, or God, an original cause uncaused by anything else. Aristotle posits this unmoved mover not so much from religious piety, but as a logical necessity. So he's the father of Western logic. So metaphysics is not just an esoteric branch of academic philosophy. It is the foundation of our entire civilization, our sense of right and wrong, of duties and rights, of justice and injustice. The Declaration of Independence bases human rights on a self-evident metaphysical fact that we're endowed by a creator with rights, and so on. And as the philosopher David Hume pointed out and emphasized, we cannot derive a metaphysical fact from a physical fact. We accept metaphysical facts because they are self-evidently true. As Aristotle explains in his Metaphysics, just wrapping up here, we cannot demonstrate metaphysical truths because they serve as the basis for all demonstration. They cannot be proven through prior principles since there are none prior to them. They present themselves to us as powerful, self-evident truths, not empirical measurements. So now I want to move on and talk about directly Darwin. and how Darwin dealt with metaphysics, because he did. And, scholars basically all agree that even in the origin of species, Darwin gets into philosophical issues. And I'm going to talk about how, and Betty talked about this really in a really good way, and how philosophy and science up to, the last part of the 1800s were kind of together, and then they separated, and that has caused a lot of troubles, as I'll explain. So among the lower beasts, survival of the fittest is often brutal, savage, and merciless. In chapter 5 of The Descent of Man, 1871, Darwin suggests that we must not flinch in applying the same principle, the same brutal principle, savagery, survival of the fittest, but we must not flinch in applying the same principle to human beings. He states that conscientious health care for everyone, conscientious health care, that's not, well, I guess for Republicans it's kind of controversial. He states that conscientious health care for everyone is, quote, highly injurious. It's a bad thing. Highly injurious to the race of man. With savages, the weak in body or mind are soon eliminated, and those that survive commonly exhibit a vigorous state of health. We, civilized men, on the other hand, and that's nothing could be more quintessentially Victorian than we are the civilized people of Earth. We civilized men, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the process of elimination. That means basically letting people die when you could save them. So we do our utmost to check the process, to save lives. We build asylums for the imbecile, the maimed, and the sick. We institute poor laws, and our medical men exert their utmost skill to save the life of everyone to the last moment. Thus, but this is a problem for Darwin. This is not like, oh, this is great. Anyway, I'll get into it later. Thus, the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. It's a really injurious thing that we have compassionate medical programs. That's not good. So these medical checks, in other words, checking survival of the fittest, stopping survival of the fittest, so these medical checks, he means here stopping medical care, like, no, don't give medical care to the poor, don't give medical care to the uneducated, let them die. So these medical checks, although contrary, and so he's saying if you want to check that, it's like, let's stop all this medical care. It's contrary to the spirit of humanity, but it's actually, these checks are of the greatest importance. It's of the greatest importance to let weaker human beings and stupider human beings die. That's of the greatest importance, unquote. Ironically, Darwin spent the summer of 1825 as an apprentice doctor, helping his father treat the poor of Shropshire, but I guess it didn't really rub off. In a letter to Alfred Russel Wallace, the co-inventor of natural selection, dated 1869, this 10 years after origin, Darwin acknowledged Wallace's concerns about social applications of evolutionary theory, but remained fixed on the need to permit only the fittest humans to survive. Quote, I'm inclined to think that in man, as in other animals, natural selection acts mainly by the preservation of the most vigorous and healthiest individuals, and I cannot see how it can be harmful to allow this process to operate naturally. In other words, if we just allow survival of the fittest, even if, whatever that means, however brutal or genocidal that gets, Darwin can't imagine how that could be harmful to society. Different strokes for different folks. Alfred Lord Wallace, in his Contributions to the Theory of Natural Selection, 1870, argues that the very impracticality of purely moral and intellectual notions shows that they are not the product of blind evolution, which would not select them, and thus must come from our spiritual nature. So Alfred Lord Wallace is turning Darwin's argument against him. He's saying, look, if you say, as you do say, Darwin, that compassion, saving people medically, protecting the weak. If we say that all these things are bad for evolution, then the fact that we have all these feelings of compassion could not have been selected by evolution. because it's against survival of the fittest. Therefore, you cannot attribute our compassion to blind evolutionary forces. That's Wallace's argument. It's a good argument. So Wallace said the present enormous development of the moral and intellectual faculties in civilized man, moral faculties, could not possibly have been acquired under the law of evolution by natural selection because they're of no direct use to man in the struggle for existence. Darwin answered this claim in a letter to J.D. Hooker in 1871. I'm very much inclined to believe that in the future we shall all regard the human species as one amongst the innumerable productions of nature. In other words, hey everybody, we're beasts, we're animals, get over it. And that as humans, we are subject to the same laws as other animals, and that there is no particular reason for considering the moral faculties as a special gift. Whoa. The fact that unlike savage, brutal animals, we have compassion, we care about others, even about animals, that's not a gift. That's an obstacle to evolution. Survival of the fittest. Similarly, in The Descent of Man, Darwin wrote, there is no fundamental difference between man and the higher animals in their mental faculties. The difference is one of degree only. Darwin is fighting against the inclusion of moral or metaphysical ideas. In other words, he's not using the word obviously back then, but he's pushing physicalism. Metaphysical ideas have no place in science. That means no moral guardrails. Nature will do it all. And of course, this is very metaphysical. It's a belief that somehow nature, without God, nature itself has some kind of divine mission to raise up human beings to higher levels. So, philosophically, it's not very coherent at all. And we're going to explain why in a while. Darwin focused almost exclusively on the science of evolution, whereas Wallace also studied metaphysical works. Wallace said man's higher moral and intellectual nature, as well as his spiritual nature, anyway, I've said before, not the result of evolution. They're spiritual, he said. So Peter J. Bowler is the past president of the British Society for the History of Science. Wikipedia claims that his 1984 book, Evolution, The History of an Idea, is a standard textbook on the history of evolution. Bowler explains that Darwin, quote, Darwin saw no reason to establish moral guidelines to govern the application of natural selection, even when it came to humans. For Darwin, there was no indication that natural selection should be influenced by moral or spiritual considerations. In other words, kill the weaker and don't get hung up on humanitarian sentiments. That's me. So anyway, I've got all these quotes that confirm this, from really good scholars, that Darwin was absolutely opposed to interfering with brutal natural selection by bringing in moral considerations. So then we have Malthus. For Darwin and Herbert Spencer, Thomas Malthus's ideas about population growth and resource scarcity were foundational. So Malthus basically said that populations grow exponentially, but resources don't grow exponentially. So inevitably, you're going to have a lot of humans dying off because the population has exceeded the resources. And that's just life. Don't worry about it. So Malthus proposed that famine, disease, and other checks on population were natural mechanisms to control growth. Not all members of society would survive. Influenced by Malthus, Darwin appreciated that in nature, individuals with traits better suited to their environment should survive and reproduce, passing on advantageous traits. He acknowledged Malthus in his On the Origin of Species. Herbert Spencer coined the term survival of the fittest and applied it to human societies. While Darwin used Malthusian ideas in a biological context, Spencer extended them to justify social and economic inequalities, even when they became deadly. So anyway, I'm going to skip some of this stuff. Spencer's arguing for that. So Malthus was appropriated by people that followed Darwin. So Malthusian logic was also invoked in eugenics programs, which I'm going to talk about next, eugenics. aimed at controlling population quality, in which you prevent unfit people from reproducing. So Charles Dickens famously exposed the danger of these ideas, of the application of Malthusian theory to social Darwinism in A Christmas Carol, published a week before Christmas in 1843. This is before Darwin. A gentleman asked Scrooge to give a donation for the poor. Quote, "At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge," said the gentleman, taking up a pen to note, how much Scrooge is going to give, "it is more than usually desirable," a typical Victorian way of speaking, "it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute who suffer greatly at the present time." "Are there no prisons?" asked Scrooge. "Plenty of prisons," said the gentleman, laying down the pen again, "and the union workhouses, which were horrible, in unbearable places to live." "And the union workhouses," demanded Scrooge, "are they still in operation?" "They are, still," returned the gentleman. "I wish I could say they were not. Many cannot go there, and many would rather die." "If they would rather die," said Scrooge, "they had better do it and decrease the surplus population." That is pure Malthusian logic, and Darwin embraced it, and Herbert Spencer even took it to the next level. So one last quote from Darwin. Two quotes from The Descent of Man in chapter 6. First quote, "At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world." Next quote, "The more civilized Caucasian races have beaten the Turkish hollow in the struggle for existence, looking to the world at no very distant date. What an endless number of the lower races," non-white, what an endless number of the lower races will have been eliminated by the higher civilized races throughout the world. In other words, the laws of nature are going to engage us in genocide, and again, don't mess up nature with moral considerations. So you can see why I want to talk, and these are, of course, metaphysical views by Darwin. It's not to say that there are certain laws of nature that favor natural selection doesn't mean we should allow that, because any English sentence that has the word should in that way is actually a metaphysical claim. I mean, there's a few technical exceptions perhaps, but in this context, philosophy, absolutely no exceptions. So if you form an English sentence and say should or should not, you have made a metaphysical claim, not a scientific claim, not an empirical claim. So next we go to eugenics, which is very horrific. So the Oxford Dictionary explains eugenics as, quote, "the study of how to arrange reproduction within a human population to increase the occurrence of heritable," in other words, favorable characteristics regarded as desirable, developed largely by Sir Francis Galton, Darwin's cousin. He coined the term eugenics in 1883, just about when Darwin was leaving this world, or just after, as a method of improving the human race. So Daniel J. Kevels of Yale writes in his book, In the Name of Eugenics, although Darwin himself did not advocate eugenics, his ideas about the role of natural selection in improving species were absorbed by his contemporaries and successors, particularly Francis Galton, his cousin, was the most prominent of these followers, and he founded the modern eugenics movement. He argued that human beings, like animals, could be improved through selective breeding. Then there's Eugenics Record Office, ERO, an influential institution in the United States, played a pivotal role in sterilizing undesirable human beings and pushing selective breeding, changing immigration policy. Don't let people immigrate from Southeast Europe because these are inferior races. So, but this ERO became influential in the development of Nazi eugenic policies. The Nazis thanked the scientists in England and America for enlightening them as to the critical importance of eugenics. Of course, the rise of Nazi eugenics and its link to racial genocide ended the credibility of eugenic movements worldwide, including the US. So here's from Kevels again. Eugenics, which was originally advocated by American and European scientists to improve the human gene pool through selective breeding, found a horrific application in Nazi Germany. But the Nazis are applying eugenics from England. Inspired by eugenics, they implemented policies of forced sterilization, euthanasia, and ultimately genocide in their quest for a racially pure society. And then Thomas C. Leonard of Princeton has this award-winning book, Illiberal Reformers, Race, Eugenics, and American Economics in the Progressive Era. And he writes that the eugenic ideas were not just inspired by Darwin's work, but were actively shaped by Darwin's followers, who emphasized the need for a more interventionist approach to human evolution, something that Darwin said is inevitable, and don't stop it. So eugenics found a particularly receptive audience in Nazi Germany. The American eugenics movement inspired the German eugenicists. And they copied American laws, eugenics laws. The Nazis actually copied them. Steven Pinker of Harvard wrote, the eugenics movement, which advocated for selective breeding and sterilization, was one of the darker chapters of the 20th century. It took the logic of Darwinian natural selection, competition for survival, the elimination of the unfit, and applied it to human society. And remember, Darwin said there's no big difference between human beings and animals. So just as you can't interfere with natural selection among animals, don't interfere among humans. Darwin, I gave you those quotations. Anyway, it comes down to Hitler, who praises this stuff. It comes down to all these Nazi leaders praising it. So I'm going to skip a lot of this, but all the great heroes of the Nazis, Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsfuhrer, Ernst Rudin, prominent Nazi eugenicist, said the new Reich has set itself to promote the biological well-being of the German people with a ruthlessness that we have not seen before. We owe much to the foundations laid by earlier eugenic thinkers, particularly those in England, the followers of Darwin, and America. So the Nazis are, a tip of the Nazi cap. So remember Wallace's warning about the danger of imbalance between the physical and the metaphysical. And remember that Darwin rejected Wallace's idea, found this unnecessary and even harmful to human progress. Joseph Glass quote from the Nazis, Joseph Goebbels, Nazi propaganda minister, the science of eugenics, from the Darwinians, has shown us the path toward cleansing and strengthening our race. So anyway, I'll stop there, and I know don't have a lot of time. So now I want to show how, we can talk about all the incredible atrocities, genocidal atrocities perpetrated by, to be honest, Christianity. And of course, also Islam had a hand in some of that. So, history, as Hegel pointed out, and as Marx embraced this idea, history tends to move dialectically. You get a thesis, you get an antithesis. And so what we're seeing now is a full-on antithesis to religious madness and religious genocide. We're going to get the equal and opposite genocidal madness. This is, Galileo, among other things, did a lot of studies of pendulums. And it turns out that the time it takes for the pendulum to go from one end to the other depends not only on the number of degrees it's going, but also on the length of the pendulum. So, there's technical terms for this, which I won't bother looking up now. And so if you apply this pendulum effect, which is simply the Hegelian or the Marxian dialectic, thesis, antithesis, then because this murderous religious fanaticism went on so long, for so many centuries, it produced a very powerful reaction, which was equally genocidal, which I'm going to explain now. So, in preparation for that, I want to show that science itself, unlike what Darwin argued, science itself is not self-regulating. It's not that if you just let science go at it, we'll ultimately come to a better kind of human life. No. And I'll give some examples. The European age of exploration, which quickly spawned the age of colonialism, inspired a large number of scientific breakthroughs in navigation technology, shipbuilding, cartography, weaponry, and many other fields. The rush to enslave and, if necessary, kill non-white people all over the world led to many scientific discoveries. The Nazi regime's evil lust for power and racial domination led to significant scientific and technological progress. The V-2 rocket, first long-range guided ballistic missile, the world's first operational jet fighter, the development of U-boats with advanced propulsion systems. And of course, behind all this applied science, there's a lot of pure science, because you have to have something to apply. Advanced tanks like the Tiger and Panther, medical research into hypothermia treatment, aviation medicine, and surgical techniques. These findings and many more came at the cost of unspeakable inhumanity. But again, Darwin didn't want moral guardrails. Doesn't mean he would approve the Holocaust or all these things, but he did lay down the principles to be followed. So in the name of science, Marxist regimes, now we're going to get the full, equal and opposite genocidal evil reaction to genocidal religious war. Marxist regimes in the Soviet Union, China, and then Cambodia raised science to a central role in governance and ideology. Science was not merely a tool to advance societal goals, but a weapon against religion and traditional metaphysics. Religion was an opiate for the masses and a tool for oppressing them. So now get this, institutions like, I love this one, the Soviet League of the Militant Godless, that was the real name, the Soviet League of the Militant Godless, actively promoted atheism through science education. This is physicalism, unchained. Scientific achievements were evidence against religious worldviews. And I don't want to go, I have a lot of evidence of this. And then you get Stalin, and then you get Mao, the same thing. Religion is evil. Religion is the enemy. It's an enemy of science, because Marx insisted that, communism was science. It was social science. And so the Cultural Revolution, anyway, they killed a lot of priests. And it was always science instead of religion. Science proves that religion is evil. And so I'll just get down to the numbers because, to save time. A conservative estimate would be, from scholars, that the atheist scientific Soviet regime, Lenin, Stalin, all those great guys, caused the death of around 25 million Russians. Put that in perspective, that's double the Holocaust. In American universities, Marxism is kind of still a little sexy for some people. But if you're a Nazi on an American campus, you're, my God. And yet, just the Soviets, Marxism caused the death of twice the Holocaust. Scholars estimate that the total deaths caused by Mao's policies fall within the range of 40 to 80 million. That's 4 times the Holocaust. Because most agree on a minimum of 45 million, 4 times the Holocaust. Maoist China. Scholars estimate that up to 2.5 million people died during the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia. That was up to 30% of the whole population. That would be like murdering 100 million people in America. And this was Marxism. So, and again, the Holocaust, a mere 11 to 12 million. And of course, that was directly inspired by the idea of eugenics. So it's hard to ignore the extraordinary evil done in recent history in the name of science and materialism. Of course, in a physicalist world, there are no objective moral laws, no divine judge. We've already seen how Darwin foresaw no serious problem with letting natural selection and survival of the fittest run their natural course in human society. It's this very metaphysical idea that somehow natural selection is somehow, there's no God and there's no soul, but it's somehow this physical spirit that knows what it's doing, which is very interesting. And there's a reason why they came to such silly conclusions, which I'll explain in a little while. So, after the morally catastrophic 20th century, some philosophers attached to physicalism and atheism have tried to philosophically justify objective, binding moral rules within a physicalist universe. Their tragicomic result is called compatibilism. Compatibilism tries to show that objective, binding moral laws are compatible, rationally compatible with a physicalist, atheist, determinist worldview. Of course, it does nothing of the sort, but let's take a look. We know that we are only morally responsible for our actions if we choose them freely. We cannot be morally responsible for actions that we did not choose. Basically, compatibilists radically change the definition of free will and then declare that their so-called free will, which is not free will at all, is compatible with physical determinism. The traditional notion of metaphysical freedom is the ability to act freely, independently, free of causal determination. Instead, compatibilists define free will in terms of internal emotional states and the absence of external coercion. The problem is that in a deterministic world, our internal states are just as predetermined as any external state. So the difference between internal and external is meaningless here. For compatibilists, free will does not, and they actually believe this. I mean, these are actually people that get jobs in universities. For compatibilists, free will does not require the ability to have acted otherwise. It only requires that a so-called agent's actions stem from internal desires, intentions, or rational deliberations, even if those internal states are ultimately predetermined by prior external causes. After all, in a physicalist world, there are no non-physical entities to cause anything. This conception makes free will a subjective feeling rather than an existential reality, reducing it to a description of how decisions feel to the so-called agent rather than a genuine power to act freely and truly shape outcomes in the world. Under determinism, even internal desires and reasoning are products of prior neurological causes beyond our will. So to wrap this up, if every aspect of my decision-making is causally determined, my choices are not choices at all. They are the inevitable outcomes of a chain of causes beyond my power. I'm programmed to think that I'm choosing. While I might feel that I'm acting freely, that feeling would simply be a product of those same deterministic processes. An illusion, not true freedom. Anyway, I think you get the point. I, couldn't help getting a few more shots in, but I'll skip it for now. And so I want to talk now. There's just two more points I want to make. I know I'm taking a lot of time. One is the war on philosophy. We've already seen how in Darwin's time, there was sort of a declared war against fanatical religion. But power corrupts. And so as science is exploding with all kinds of inventions and discoveries and technologies, it really becomes like king of the hill. And so pride comes before the fall. So having first rejected religion, science now, methodological atheism, which I think is not the best term. I think methodological naturalism would do the trick. But anyway, having sort of, I'll read what I wrote. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the disciplines of science and philosophy were not as distinct as they are today. Scientists of this era were referred to as natural philosophers. They tried to understand the natural world through observation, experimentation, and reasoning, deeply rooted in philosophical inquiry. So anyway, even Darwin does a bit of this. And, I had all these examples. I'm going to really skip a lot of this. But Ernest Mach, whose ideas were crucial to the development of Einstein's relativity, also made extensive philosophical contributions. John Stuart Mill, who was a philosopher, influenced scientific practice. But the 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, saw this fantastic rise of scientific progress, which meant specialization, subdivisions, sub-subdivisions of science, specialized academic departments, and specialized journals. Interdisciplinary work became less common compared to the 19th century. And the 21st century, it goes even further. So Dr. Laura Snyder, distinguished scholar of the history of science, states in the 19th century, there was no divide between the scientist and the philosopher. Prominent thinkers saw their work in science intimately bound up with their philosophical reflections. Thomas Kuhn, in his structure of scientific revolutions, increasing specialization made the scientist and the philosopher increasingly separate figures. Anyway, I've got lots of quotes for that, but there was a price to pay. And of course, you can even talk about Newton and Descartes in terms of combining science and philosophy. Joseph Priestley and Mary Shelley, who raised ethical questions about scientific experimentation, her book Frankenstein. So Frankenstein was a philosophical critique of the dangers of science. So I want to talk about one guy, because I really think he's like really interesting, and that's William Whewell, 1794 to 1866. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy states Whewell was one of the most important and influential figures in 19th century Britain. Whewell, a polymath, wrote extensively on mechanics, mineralogy, geology, astronomy, political economy, theology, educational reform, international law and architecture, a lot of things. One of the founding members and president of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, fellow of the Royal Society, president of the Geological Society, longtime master of Trinity College, Cambridge. His influence was acknowledged by great scientists of the day, including Charles Darwin, Lyell, Faraday, etc., etc., etc. Whewell invented the terms anode and cathode, if I'm pronouncing them right, and ion. He did that as a favor for his friend Faraday. So, in response to a challenge by the poet Coleridge, in 1833, Whewell invented the English word scientist. Anyway, all these prominent people were polymaths. So I'm going to skip a lot of this. I mean, it's interesting, but there's no time. But having waged war against religion and significantly reduced its stature in learned Western society, and witnessing the extraordinary progress of science in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, some leading scientists now trained their guns on philosophy itself. After all, Auguste Comte had declared philosophy to be merely the middle stage of human intellectual evolution. The lowest, of course, is religion, theology, and then you get philosophy, and then you finally get the perfection of human intelligence, which is science. So, meeting in Vienna in the 1920s, a group of prominent scientists declared that science was the only valid way to pursue knowledge. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Coming from this fanatical culture, sort of fanatical Christianity, now they became the equal and opposite fanaticism. We've already seen how the Marxists became this, they went, they totally competed for genocide with anything ever done in Christianity, because they had industrial technology. They could take genocide to the next level. So now we have the scientists, empiricists, saying that not only don't we need philosophy, because people like Kant and Mill have said that science is above philosophy, these people are going to become known as logical empiricists or logical positivists. They declare that philosophy is meaningless. Philosophy is meaningless. They say that any statement which cannot be empirically verified is meaningless. You didn't say anything. It's a meaningless babbling. So this bold and rather reckless project became known as logical positivism. A.J. Ayer was a distinguished Oxford philosopher who brought logical positivism to Britain. But later, he and most other philosophers realized that logical positivism was self-contradictory and so meaningless. And here you have to understand metaphysics. The self-contradiction is quite simple. We cannot empirically verify the claim that all truth claims must be empirically verified. Because to say that only empiricism is a valid way of knowing is a metaphysical claim. But of course, if you don't know philosophy, you won't know that. And if you think that we scientists don't need philosophy, you're going to start saying some really silly things. Thus, logical empiricism is itself not an empirical claim. It is a metaphysical claim about empiricism. Thus, if logical empiricism is true, it is not true. In other words, it is literally nonsense. So what happens is that the philosophers figure this out, but the scientists, in all their glory, their advancing science, didn't get the memo. Because their attitude is, to hell with philosophy. We can contradict ourselves. We're omnipotent. Which is interesting because it's exactly what fanatical Christians used to say, literally, back in the Middle Ages and other ages, that we can contradict ourselves because we have the highest truth. And now you get empiricists saying we can contradict ourselves. So on both sides, it's basically nonsense. So in a 1977 interview, when asked what was it that logical positivists were campaigning so passionately against, what were the logical positivists against? I replied, primarily they were against metaphysics. Again, that was the enemy. Metaphysics is the enemy because metaphysics talks about things that are real but not empirical. So metaphysics, that means justice is the enemy. Equality is the enemy. Beauty is the enemy. Compassion is the enemy. Now, scientists may not have known this because they didn't know philosophy. So Ayer says, any suggestion that there might be a world beyond the ordinary world of science, they reject it as meaningless. So power corrupts. And anyway, there's a long list of very distinguished scholars at the best universities who, talk about this. So the celebrated theoretical physicist Richard Feynman allegedly said, philosophy of science is as useful to scientists as ornithology is to birds. Sarcastic. The late Nobel physicist Stephen Weinstein found this remark to be so clever that in his book, he's a Nobel physicist, in his book, The First 3 Minutes, he paraphrased, philosophy is not necessary for science, just as ornithology is not necessary for birds. With this clever little remark, what they overlooked is that birds are not very bright. I mean, they know what they need to do, like reproduce and adapt to their environment. Birds do not have rational self-awareness, nor a coherent grasp of life in general. Thus, it would be a blessing indeed for birds to acquire the rational awareness of a philosopher. Birds basically eat, defend, sleep, and mate. Did Dr. Feynman and Dr. Weinberg really identify scientists with birds? But this is not the only evidence that many scientists and other scholars really could use some philosophy. I'm going to review some other examples of the philosophical illiteracy which is found among many scientists. Not all, I'm not saying all, and so I'm just going to wrap up here. Let's talk about rules of logic. Remember, the logical, some scientists and some Christians would say, we can contradict ourselves, not a problem. In philosophy, as in so many areas of life, the maxim, use it or lose it, applies. Unfortunately, science more or less abandoned philosophy, which includes logic. So the principle of equal domain, let's jump into it. Every claim, this is a principle of logic, I claim. Every claim, whether positive or negative, in other words, whether it affirms or denies a proposition, is necessarily made within a specific domain, such as biology, poetry, physics, philosophy, mathematics, history, etc. Number 2, a negative claim, which entails the denial of a positive claim, necessarily belongs to the same topical domain as the positive claim. For example, actually, I had some pictures, but I'm just going to not get entangled with them. For example, consider these mathematical claims expressed in the form of equations. 2 plus 2 equals 4. 2 plus 2 does not equal 4. 2 plus 2 equals 5. 2 plus 2 does not equal 5. These are all mathematical claims regardless of whether they are true or false. In this case, A and D are correct. 2 and 2 are 4, 2 and 2 are not 5. B and C, 2 and 2 are not 4, 2 and 2 are 5, are incorrect, but the truth or untruth of the claims does not change their domain. Right or wrong, they're all mathematical claims. The entry on metaphysics from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, again, can't go wrong with Stanford, illustrates this principle of equal domain. Quote, ancient and medieval philosophers might have said that metaphysics was the science that studied being as such, or the first causes of things, or things that do not change. A philosopher who denied the existence of these things, in other words, there are no first things, there are no spiritual things, who denied the existence of those things, first causes or unchanging things, would now be considered by contemporary philosophy to be making thereby a metaphysical assertion. So if you affirm, let's say, God or deny God, those are equally metaphysical. Similarly, Nobel laureate, one of the worst, anyway, I have my opinions about Jean-Paul Sartre. Similarly, Nobel laureate Jean-Paul Sartre stated, quote, I do not think myself any less a metaphysician in denying the existence of God than Leibniz was in affirming it, unquote. These examples illustrate what I call the law of equal domain. To deny or affirm a claim is to make a claim in the same domain. Now, consider these claims where 0 indicates nothing. I use sort of algebraic notation because, anyway, I thought it would be clear. A, God plus nature equals evolution. What I mean by that is you have God and you have nature, and when God fools around with nature, you get evolution. B, God plus nature do not bring about evolution, do not equal evolution. C, God plus 0, which I just mean nothing else. Nature plus nothing else gives you evolution. D, nature plus nothing else does not give you evolution. In other words, you need something more than the laws of nature. These are all equally metaphysical claims. These are not none of these is a scientific claim, an empirical claim. Since A, the claim that God plus nature brings about evolution, is a metaphysical claim, or you could say a religious claim, the denial of that claim, B, must be equally metaphysical or religious. This is significant since many scientists believe they're making a scientific claim when they say that nature alone causes evolution without divine intervention. But logically, that would be a metaphysical, even a religious claim. Whether it's right or wrong, it's a metaphysical, even a religious claim, since it denies a metaphysical or religious claim. Thus, scientists who do not bother to learn much about philosophy or logic are prone to make religious claims in the name of science. If we aspire to pure methodology in science, we must cleanse it of unnecessary metaphysical and even religious assumptions, such as theism or atheism, which logically are equally religious positions. After all, and in America, by the way, atheism is legally a religion. You get tax exemption as a religion for an atheist society. After all, if to attribute evolution to God is a religious claim, to deny that some God participates in evolution is equally a religious claim, since it denies a religious claim. A scientist is free to affirm or deny divine design, but one does so as a theologian, not as a scientist. Unfortunately, science broke the chains of fanatical religion only to forge the new chains of fanatical physicalism. Not everyone, not every scientist, but there's enough of it. Scientists might have avoided this confusion had they maintained their link to philosophy and logic. So now I want to give some pseudo-scientific arguments given by scientists in favor of evolution. Note how these pseudo-scientific arguments come not from science, but from theology. A, the problem of evil. And it's not that every scientist gives this, it's not that every scientist believes this, but it's out there. It's out there. It's part of what's going on. Evolution involves So here's the problem with you. Evolution involves significant suffering, death, and extinction over millions of years. As I said, survival of the fittest is a pretty brutal process. Atheist scientists argue that this is, some atheist scientists, not all, argue that this is inconsistent with the idea of a benevolent and omnipotent God, the theodicy argument. If God exists, why would he create a world that relies on such a brutal process? This is a theological argument based on the assumption that if there were a God, he would do things in a particular way, or that a good God would have no good reason to do evolution in the way we observe it. And by the way, there are philosophical refutations of this argument, but for now, I simply want to show its category. This is a theological argument. So, the argument from imperfection, which is similar. Evolution theory suggests that life forms are not perfectly designed, but are instead the result of historical contingencies and adaptations to specific environments. Imperfections and vestigial traits are seen as evidence that life evolved through random natural processes, rather than being designed by a perfect designer or creator.
We need to wrap up within a few minutes, please.
Okay, I will.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, I will wrap up now. So, but again, that's a theological argument. Or that there's the argument that 99.9% of species didn't make it. If God created species, why the failure rate? Well, to call it a failure is to assume that if God created species, he would have or should have made them exist perpetually. Really? Again, scholars are making theological assumptions about the nature of God or what a real God would do in the name of science. So anyway, so it's interesting how sometimes atheists claim the right to define the God that doesn't exist. That's anyway. So I'm going to wrap this up now. Last point, I promise the last point. Physicalists argue that no empirical evidence suggests for supernatural involvement in the evolution process. This lack of empirical evidence for God, they say, supports the claim that either God does not exist or is not necessary to explain life's diversity. The above argument has a practical and a categorical problem. Practically, there are sophisticated mathematical arguments that aim to show the absurd improbability of unguided evolution. And of course, there are sophisticated mathematical arguments that try to refute this. I'm not a mathematician. I just want to say there are very powerful arguments on both sides. It's not a slam dunk for atheism. So this argument is absurd, the argument that there's no empirical evidence for God, because as the great skeptic philosopher David Hume pointed out almost 3 centuries ago, no empirical facts can prove or disprove a metaphysical claim. And I think I've explained that metaphysical means beyond the empirical. So again, one simple and then another last argument. Under standard atmospheric pressure at 100 degrees Celsius, heat turns water to steam. But that empirical fact does not make it more or less likely, that there is or is not a God who created water, heat, and the laws of nature that turn water to steam at 100 degrees Celsius. In other words, apparent causal sufficiency of a material process does not prove or even suggest that the sufficient process is absolutely autonomous, or that physical elements behave and interact in certain ways because that's just what they do. That's a metaphysical argument. I mean, it's very much a metaphysical argument. So whether or not a deity exists, whether or not the deity created water, heat, and natural laws, metaphysical question. So that's basically it. If I could just give me just 3 more minutes. Anyway, I won't read.
It was a great fix itself.
Okay, I have a long list of famous atheist scholars who admit that physicalism is just my religion. I'll just give their names. John Searle, one of the most famous atheist philosophers of our time. Very big names, very big scholars at very prestigious universities admitting that's just my religion. Or other scholars like Wolfgang Smith at MIT and UCLA saying that the atheists, even in science, seem to hold their positions with this religious fervor. So I will. I
really need you to wrap up here.
Okay, so I will wrap up here, and so my conclusion will be that we need to reunite philosophy and science, and that big mistake for science to cut itself off or philosophy. Yes.
Lost you.
Yes.
Sorry.
Okay. So I'll
Sorry, Maharaj.
okay. I'll stop
We've
here.
covered this